All right. The very first thing with organizational line is you want to think about scale. And this is kind of far away from me, so I'm going to do like pretty much a 1-to-1 scale, maybe a little larger than that, but I'll start with the spray. And the first thing that I want to do is I just want to start off with what I'm going to call a gesture. And a gesture just sort of like plants it down in terms of scale. Do I have to marry that scale? No. But that's a pretty good scale, so I'm going to run with it. Once I have and a gesture is just the like overall shape, proportion, and directionality of a subject. So for like the cup next to it, I wouldn't go any more than that, okay? And I just use like, you'll notice I'm holding the end of the charcoal pencil, so that's the easiest way to make sure that you're not making a ton of lines. The next thing I want to do is actually, I really like to use my Vine charcoal for the organizational line component because it's really easy to move around, revise, and make a straight line. So I'll cut it into 3. And the first thing I'm going to do is drawing from my shoulder is I'm going to make a straight line, which is going to be its axis. Okay? Everything will have an axis. So like if I were to go back and redo this, I would have had an axis. And I kind of suggested one here. Yeah. But an axis line really tells me like, oh, it's straight up and down. It's parallel to my picture plane. The next thing I'm going to do is just kind of like suggest things like ellipses. And I'm okay with this being like, and remember, the closer these ellipses are, so the ellipse is a circle in space, so the more that moves up, the thinner that ellipse is going to be. And where I'm not going to see the ellipse anymore is where my eye level is. Does that make sense? So as I'm looking down at it, I'm going to see a little bit of an opening of that ellipse. I'll use the same approach with extending the lines into space, just because I may alter the scale of it. I see it's a little wonky. And I just continue that. And I know that I'm going to have a bunch of ellipses because I've got this little handle thing. I know that this is a little smaller. And so I'm using the straightness of my subject or of my material here as a way to make straight lines. Once I've got the ellipse kind of planted, I know it's not correct. And remember, an ellipse does not do this. An ellipse is really a real subtle circle that I'm going to eventually kind of find, right? And it's pinched at the edges, but it's not quite that pinched. The second thing I'm going to do with an ellipse is I'm always going to have both the major axis on it and the minor axis on it, and that minor one just falls along that. Same thing up here, same thing here. So once I've got sort of this planted out, what I can actually start to do is I can use a straight edge, and I'm going to get I can use a straight edge if I want to. I don't have to. But once I've got a straight edge, I'm ready for essentially my contour. And so what I'm going to do is directly over those lines, and I'm going to be mindful and demure about my variation, my line variation. So I'll increase and decrease the pressure. I might go a little harder. Since it's small, I am going to hold it like this. And you'll see that that sort of sits on top in a graphic way. And I've actually got a bunch of ellipses here. And then I've got this little compression thing that I actually need to get right. And it's going to follow the line of this because there is yet again another axis. And that is an adequate contour. It sits on top. If I want to, I can kind of clean it up a little bit. But I want to see the scaffolding underneath. So just to review, I can do all of this with my Vine charcoal. I set up just a real quick gesture. And if I do the whole thing with this, it'll be quite dark, but that's fine. I extend my lines into space, but the first thing I need to do is indicate its directionality with an axis line. So once I've done that, then I can say, oh, it's a pretty wide one. And I'll teach you guys how to sight and measure with this a little later. I can make revisions. I can say, no, that's not right. And when I rub out kind of wide so that it's not just one little area of black. Extend the lines into space. And then I can go back and make a really beautiful. And I can just do this by hand if I want to. Just takes me a little longer. And I'm being very mindful about making any revisions that I need to. So you see that's a little bit more graphic than that, it's a little darker than that. But then what happens when I have a really, really complicated subject? I'm gonna put this a little closer to me. Okay, let's do this with this. It's a complicated subject, it's not as easy as these. I start off with the gesture. And what I'm thinking of it as is a triangle in space, okay? And that's really the first thing. I'm not gonna really get a lot of complicated stuff in there, but that's pretty good for a gesture. What's the next step? Step 2, after I do gesture. 1, gesture. 2, the axis line. So what I'm gonna do is just like loosely, what that does is that tells me the perspective of what it is I'm looking at. And honestly, that's kind of wrong. So I'm gonna change that up and I'm gonna switch to my other material and I'm gonna kind of just adjust that. And it's at this point that I can kind of start breaking down these shapes lightly so that I can make revisions. Because this stuff is really forgiving, right? And once I have something like this, I can say, well, you know, do I need to make any revisions? Yeah, I have a little nub in here, I have a little nub in here. I'll suggest those. Formally, we'll know those as nubbins. And then I'm really ready to like go into the detail. And I see that there's like just some like indentations that just kind of round that out. So as I do that beautiful contour I always want you guys to end on, so after I do my axis line, I'm extending my lines into space just to make sure that all of my lines are correct, right? And that goes up kind of that direction. We don't see a lot of that. Then I can start to sort of darken it and find those areas of graphic quality that my contour are going to pick up. Does that make sense? Okay. And you notice I'm going really quite fast. I want you guys to go a little slower, but I'm going quite fast because we're videotaping. That's an old term, videotaping. And I'll make revisions as I go. And I'm not afraid of using my straight edge if I need to, because as long as I'm pressing and lifting, what I'm going to do is be able to create a nice graphic line. Here's my thing. Do the same thing here. And I've got, what do we call that? Clips. You see that I've included both the axis and I've extended the lines into space. Now, granted, these are kind of arbitrary, and so I have to kind of use my logic about, oh, well, I don't see a lot of that, so really that's going to intersect there, right? So this is sort of a primer and a beginning on at least getting axis lines, transparency, so you're drawing everything that you don't even see. You're getting that scaffolding in, and you're not erasing it. So these have organizational line, and these are just contour. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So the contour does include a bit of the gesture, because that's how I always want you to start. But the reality is this is going to allow you to get everything correctly. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Okay. Before we move into like the really technical stuff of perspective, which is a little more like brainy. Okay. Okay, you can start.